Hi everyone, my name is Leslie and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the BookTube prize. I was part of the octafinals judging panel for nonfiction, and I can't remember which group. Again, I will put it in the description. And I just wanted to share my thoughts on the books that I had for that round. I will talk about them from the order in which you judge them. So I will start from 6 all the way to 1. To be completely honest, I read most of these at the beginning of April. So even remembering my thoughts on them it's probably not all that clear. So this may not be that great of a video, but I will do my best to share what I thought of each of the books. In the number 6 spot, I had How to Be an Antiracist by Ibram X. Kendi. And this book, there's a couple of things. I think that this book has some real potential. I just didn't love the actual construction of the book. Each chapter kind of starts out with a definition of something, and then each chapter is sort of dedicated to that definition. And I don't know, it just didn't work for me. I just did not feel connected to the author. He would use some life experiences, but I just didn't feel like connected to like the central thesis. Also, with a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, it just didn't feel as much like a how-to guide as I was actually looking for. So that was a little bit disappointing. I was looking for maybe practical ways to implement that idea, and it just didn't feel like that to me. I will say that the very end of the book, the author talks about some illnesses that he and his wife have gone through, and that part was the most powerful. I felt the real connection I at least look for in books of this nature, where you just really connect with the ideas of the author, and I wish the book was more like that. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. It's certainly not bad, and I think people, especially right now, are recommending this left and right, so that's probably just my opinion. But I think it's still worth your time if you are interested in that. The book coming in number 5 for me was Solitaire by Albert Woodfox. This is actually a super interesting story. So my criticisms with How to Be an Anti-Racist are sort of the opposite in this. I felt really connected to the author. I felt his story, which is basically wrongly accused of a crime committed while he was in prison serving time for a different sentence. And then he ended up spending over 4 decades in solitary confinement, which is just insane. Like, I keep thinking about how we have all complained about being in our homes for 2, maybe 3 months with still access to the outside as much as we want to. I mean, at least maybe our yards or the grocery store, and how stir crazy that made everybody. And then this man has spent 4 decades in solitary confinement in a prison. That is just, honestly, I don't know how the man did it. It's incredible. So that part of the story was really, really interesting. I enjoyed his talk of getting information about the Black Panther movement, and I felt that there was a lot of really good things in this. My number 1 criticism is the length of this book. It's far too long, which may have been the point, again, for some teaching about the effects of long-term solitary confinement. There may have been a bit of that in the length of the book, but in the book, there's a lot of talk of the trials. Each trial he has to do, each appeal, and they're reiterated over and over and over again. And that just got a little tedious, and I think it takes away from the gravity of the situation and his fight for reform, prison reform. I liked this book for sure. I just felt like it could have been stronger had the editing been better, in my opinion. In the 4th spot, I have Parkland by Dave Cullen. This is a story of the March for Our Lives kids. Essentially, they were kids who created that movement after the Parkland shooting in Parkland, Florida. And this book I did enjoy. I thought it was really interesting, and I felt like I learned a lot about how kids can become activists in a positive communal way, and I thought that was really interesting, and how one voice can be amplified if you stand your ground. I had read Dave Cullen's I don't know if it's his previous book, but I definitely read his book Columbine, which I just thought was so much stronger. I just enjoyed that book, even though it's still an atrocious subject matter. I just felt the in-depth analysis of that whole situation was so fascinating. And Parkland, the book, is a little more like reading a long news article, maybe. I just wasn't as interested in some of the explanations as I had hoped to be. I think a lot of people would really enjoy this book, and it's not as heavy as Columbine is, and I think it's a much more hopeful book, which I think is a really great way to talk about something so horrific. So I think that book is one the majority of people would at least find fairly interesting, but it just fell middle of the road for me. In the third spot, I had Underland by Robert McFarlane, and this is going to be the hardest book to talk about, mainly because it is so smart. It's just a book that sort of made me feel dumb, but I was like so fascinated by the idea of things underground and what that means for ecology and biology, and like exploring caves and tunnels and preserving water and things like that. Like the natural world element of it was so interesting. I have read not a ton, but a few books that really explore the natural world, and I find it so compelling for whatever reason. And usually it's over my head, but I did really enjoy this. I will say this is not really for the faint of heart. It's a pretty deep, smart book. So if you're ready to digest some of it, and as I've said, I can't even talk about it very articulately, and that's okay, but I did enjoy it. I think it has a very interesting impact to talking about the environment and those causes that do come up in our political conversations a lot. The book coming in the second place is Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. This is the story of Lori Gottlieb, who is a psychotherapist, and her conversations with some of her patients along with her own therapy journey. And this book I really, really enjoyed. I thought there was a lot of good nuggets of the way we talk about therapy, but also the way that we are desperate to change other people, but in changing other people, you realize you can't, and you need to work on yourself. I mean, that's really what you can do, is change yourself and hope that moves outward to the people in your life. And I cried in some of this book. I definitely laughed in some of this book. I just found it really interesting. I had a period of time a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, that I was really struggling with panic attacks. And I talked to a therapist for a little while, and I did find it helpful. My therapist wasn't great, I'll put that, but it really helped me to at least be open and honest. I'm a pretty guarded person. I don't like talking about feelings and being vulnerable. So I think that going through that has been helpful in not bottling everything up. So I recommend this book to someone who, one, is skeptical of therapy and what it may or may not be, and also for someone who has been through therapy and want to see other aspects of said therapy and see if maybe, if you wrote it off and said, oh, it's not for me, there's tons of different people and theories and ways to go about it. And I just thought this book was pretty refreshing in that way. It was just like a good open conversation about therapy. It didn't feel particularly preachy, and I don't know, I just really enjoyed it. And the book that came in number one for me was Charged by Emily Bazelon. This is really a book about the flaws in our justice system, but in particular prosecutors. And it follows two cases, one case in New York City and one in St. Louis, Missouri, I believe. That could be wrong, but it's another city. And basically it's sort of a tale of two cities, which is a tale of two prosecutors. How one prosecutor tries to go a different way with charging of a crime and dealing with said crime, and one prosecutor who definitely took a harsher stance on prosecution. And there's talks about bail and money and inequality in that. And I just found this really, really interesting. I am a person who has enjoyed true crime, so that element of the story is there a little bit. It's not really about the crimes that either of the two people really committed, but it is about the journey through the court system. You know, you have to take everything with a little grain of salt, of course, because every book that's written, I don't care who's writing it, has an opinion, and that opinion does filter into some of the book. And, you know, you have to take that into account when you're reading a book like this. But I felt like this seemed very impartial. It felt like talking about the upsides and the downsides of any kind of reform. And I think that's a really good conversation, because to say that we can't fix something that's broken is sad. Like, that's just a sad notion to me. And then like completely overhauling something or dismantling something seems a little bit dangerous too. But having an honest conversation of how some changes can be made to have a really big impact, and I think that's necessary, and I really enjoyed that in this book. So those are the books that I had for this round of the BookTube Prize. I am not judging for this current round, the round that's going on right now, which is okay. You know, it's just a nice break from reading a bunch of nonfiction and even like having to judge it or, you know, pick it apart in any one way. So I'm glad for a break. The 3 books from this section that are going on to the next round are Solitaire by Albert Woodfox, Underland by Robert McFarlane, and Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb. So I had one switched, but they both were about sort of the criminal justice system, and I'm glad that the Solitaire is moving on. I think it is a good book, and I think a lot of people will learn something from it, and it's an important book. So I'm really glad with those choices, and I'm glad to see that I was sort of on par with everybody else. That always feels good, that I'm not like way off the beaten path. So I hope you guys all have a great day, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.